What's good, everybody? I'm Jędrek. He's Sodek.
Hello.
And today we are here to talk about Murktide versus Living End matchup. And this is the first episode, I think. I think it will be the first Earth episode of our deep dive series that we've been asked to do for quite some time. When we asked you, our viewers, what do you want to see, the answer of like deep dive or detailed matchup description, however you phrased it, which amounted to deep dive, was, I think, by far the most frequent answer, and also a very interesting thing for us to do. So we decided to record them. We'll have some more of those coming up that we already recorded with Canister on the Living End versus Grixis Shadow and Blue Red versus Grixis Shadows matchup. So stay tuned for that. They were quite informative. But enough about things that will be. Let's talk about things that are right now. So, Sodek, what do you think about the matchup? What are your first impressions? What are the most important things? What do you think should be highlighted as the first thing in this video?
As the first thing. Okay. So first of all, I think that Living End has a slight edge before Sideboard and after Sideboard, like with more tools from the Murktide plane coming down. It's much harder to like keep up, and the matchup post Sideboard is a bit worse. But it's, from my perspective, the matchup is quite interesting to play because there are like many different ways to approach it. There are some. It's not like you are doing all the same all the time, even though if like you have to cast your cascade spell into Living End, so the game is usually over resolving this one spell, because once it resolves, it's usually Living End game. From time to time, you can steal the win as a Murktide player if you have enough creatures in the graveyard. You have, like, opponent is on the very low life total, so Lightning Bolt can kill it, etc. But overall, once Living End resolves its namesake spell, the game is over, or at least there's a huge advantage for the end player.
Okay, so would you agree that the vast majority of important actions happen on the stack? Would you say that stack is the place of focus for the matchup?
For sure. Stack is the place when, like, this matchup can be narrowed down to this one or maybe two key turns when Living End player tries to force the issue with the Cascade spell, and the question is if Murktide player has tools to fight. But there are also other things that happened not on the stack but on the board that can dictate the timing of executing this battle on the stack.
Okay,
we'll talk about it more later.
Yes, so we already established where things that happen matters, or where matters, and now we will move to what matters. And the most important thing to acknowledge is what axis of like things you generally try to win on in Magic matter most. And in that case, tempo or mana are much more important than raw card advantage, because Living End, if it resolves, provides you with a lot of let's say virtual card advantage. You get a lot of board presence for something that you didn't really invest many cards into, because all your cyclers replace themselves, so you are not investing your actual resources into cycling other than mana, which is once again the most important thing in the matchup. And because of the fact that cards matter much more than mana, we do have a bunch of different conclusions about what it means that mana is more important than cards. So I think The first thing we should focus on is how different games look when a blue-red player puts on some pressure from the earliest turn on the game versus the situation in which blue-red player just sits behind a wall of counter spells without any threat on board. How vastly different those two types of games are.
So, maybe we should discuss the first outcome when there is no pressure, because it's easier to see what will matter. If the Cascade player has infinite time to resolve its game-winning card, called, like in this situation, it's Living Hand. Living Hand player can cycle and can build his hand to find a perfect combination of Griefs with the black cards, Force of Negation, and like multiple Cascade spells. So for instance, you go Violent Outburst on opponent's end of turn, plus Force of Negation as a backup, then you untap, cast another Cascade spell. With some Griefs around, like you force the opponent to have like 4 or even more counter spells on, for example, turn 5 or 6. That's more than enough usually to to ask for. Also, when Murktide player does not have any form of pressure, we can just play land drops, and land drops are secretly good in the matchup because first of all they can pay for soft counter spells like Spell Pierce or Thunderstorm post sideboard, and it lets you cast 2 Cascade spells on your turn. So for instance, if you have 6 mana, you can go Shardless, they counter, you play another Shardless, and hope that the second Living End will resolve.
Like most extreme cases, you can even start hardcasting your creatures, and like Murktide kinda has to counter Striped Riverwinder or they can't beat it on board, and they don't have that many counter spells game 1 because most lists will run somewhere between 7 to 9 counter spells, I would say. 4 counter spells are stock, and then most people will have either 1 or 2 Spell Pierces and somewhere from 2 to 3 Archmage's Charms. So spending counter spell on a seemingly irrelevant or like in theory irrelevant card like Striped Riverwinder that almost never hits the stack is a huge deal for Living End player because it's one less counter spell to get through when you actually want to resolve your things.
Yeah, like in practice, Murktide player should be able to play Murktide to clock the Stripe Rivenwinder aggro. But especially post sideboard, like casting Curator of Mysteries is not the worst play actually because it's a 4/4 flyer. So if the opponent didn't have any creatures to clock you, then you can just start forcing them to do something and tap out. So this will let you cast your Cascade spell and hope that they will run out of mana for counter magic to stop you. Like we said about the situation without Ragavan, but there's also from time to time they have turn 1 Ragavan.
About 40% of the time.
Yeah, and that if you know we are playing against Living Hand, you can even hard mulligan to, maybe not hard mulligan, but mulligan 6 out of 10 hand and hope to get a Ragavan and Swapian.
I'd be very inclined to mulligan a hand without Ragavan if I don't have against Living Hand. There are obviously some hands, especially on the draw or on the play rather. We'll talk about later on. But if you're on the draw and you don't have Ragavan, you basically need a hand along the lines of Spell Pierce to counterspell, Spell Pierce counterspell, with some way of putting pressure later on. So you can, for example, play a Murktide with 2 counterspells backup on 5 or something like this. And that's still usually not that great given the fact that they have Griefs and Forces. So Ragavan, by far the card that you want to see in your opening hand the most against Living End, because even though counter spells are obviously important to stop them, you can actually dig towards counter spell with Consider, and with Ragavan you are getting more mana, so you can cast expressive iterations and find a meaningful interaction this way. And Ragavan is a very time sensitive card that you really want to play as soon as possible, and counter spells start getting important when you actually need them. So you actually have 2 or 3 turns to find those counter spells, unlike finding your clock, which has to be there from basically turn 1.
Okay, and what happens like from the Living End side when the opponent starts with Ragavan? This changes the situation significantly because you just can't wait forever. The Ragavan deals you damage, so it's easier to kill you. Also, more importantly, gives them treasure tokens, so more mana, so it's much harder to tempo them out with spells. So for instance, it's much harder to play Violent Outburst with phone backup and hope that's enough, because without Ragavan, maybe they will have only 1 counter spell to protect it, but with mana from Ragavan, they will have like 4 or more mana open, so 2 counter spells would be life. So there's one thing. It also forces you to try to resolve your Living End, not like after you cycle to like 20-30 power on board, like in the graveyard, but when you can resolve it. So for instance, if your cyclers were not the best, so for like you cycled Architects of Will and Curator of Mysteries, and that's it. Like even if you resolve your Living End, like mostly you're doing this to not let Ragavan attack you more, you return only 7 power, so that's not a game-winning situation. So Ragavan gives them mana and forces you to act when you don't want to actually, because like in ideal situation you would like to resolve your Living End when the board will be a game-winning play. It's not that easy otherwise.
All right. So, as you already could probably figure out, because you are playing Magic the Gathering, but being on the play is pretty good. And it's even more so in a matchup so mana dependent as this one. Because if you, for example, play a matchup against, mostly attrition-based matchups, against like Fotzi's deck and stuff, it's not as important to go first. Of course, it's profitable, especially in a Ragavan world, but in general, it's not that big of a deal to lose a die roll against, for example, a Death Shadow deck or in a mirror. But against Living End, that's one of the most important things, because you have more mana to spare or to spend before their Cascade turn if you're on the draw, which is quite obvious. But what follows is that you actually can threaten them with a 2-drop creature on the play, unlike when you're on the draw and you only can have a 1-drop. Which means that on the play you can either have a quick Murktide, which does not happen all that often, but can happen. It basically requires you to have Mishra's Bubble, Consider, and 2 fetch lands, and you bin whatever you consider into. So you have a 4/4, or if you bin an instant or sorcery, a 5/5 Murktide, which actually is a quite decent clock, usually enough to kill them in 3 turns with like Lightning Bolt or something. But it is not manageable in the draw. Well, if you don't have a counterspell, of course, you will try to play it and you'll hope for the best that they won't Cascade. But Living End is such a strong deck, mostly because they will, in the vast majority of cases, Cascade on turn 3 if they want to. So that's the most important thing regarding play draw, in my opinion, against Murktide, or against Living End as a Murktide deck. What do you think about that, Sodek?
I'm very scared about, like when I'm on a draw as a Living End player, I really don't want to see turn to Ledger Shredder, because I know that like if they don't have it, then I know that every Ledger Shredder they draw will be maybe not dead, but it will be much harder for them to cast them. Like there are there are only 2 windows to cast it. First in turn 2 when they are on the play, because if we cast them on a draw, there's a very big chance that you go turn 3 third land cascade and they are tap out, and they maybe not lose on the spot because maybe you won't have that many creatures in graveyard to return, but it's a really strong position to attack the opponent. And the second window is like on turn 5 or turn 6 when you can keep 2 counter spells up. So that's a good difference. Also, the ability connive. That's something that can steal games. The Murktide player has one guaranteed connive trigger when I play my cascade spell, because I go for instance Shardless Agent into a living end, so I give them one card, which is kind of annoying if I want to protect my combo with Grief, because I see that the coast is clear, then I go for the cascade and they will have one more draw to find a counter spell or like spell pierce, whatever. We can't do that much about it. Maybe outside, like you were mentioned it earlier, offline, when like you can go Grief into another Grief then cascade, but that's very ambitious.
That's very hard to set up, even though it can happen, of course.
And when the Murktide player has Ledger Shredder turn 2, and you can't punish them with your cascade spell, then they can just end of turn consider Lightning Bolt in the mid game, and this has an opportunity to discard Murktide Regent. And after your living end, they will have at least one flyer that can threaten to kill you, because when they cast another Murktide, they have the first Murktide will grow into like 7, 7, 8, 8, whatever, and can end the game on the spot.
Yes, we actually did play some games with Sodek beforehand. Not a lot, but we've had enough of our own experience in the matchup, not against each other, but other players, that we just wanted to consult on some dynamics of the matchup and stuff like that. But there were some games, one game in particular, when I had Shredder and I discarded like 3 creatures to connive trigger. There were 2 Murktides and a Snapcaster Mage. And when Sodek living ended, I got 3 creatures back. I flashbacked Lightning Bolt to grow my Murktides, and I just kill him with Murktides. So this, of course, was a fairly unique, maybe not unique, but unlikely situation. Like, you do connive a lot with Shredder in this matchup, because, as Sodek said, by the virtue of Cascade mechanic, you will have one guaranteed connive, and you also quite often will connive thanks to your own spells on the Cascade turn, because it is very likely for them to have some sort of interaction. So you will have another either counterspell or maybe a consider to find the counterspell, and you will connive again. So you will quite often discard at least 2 cards to connive. But yeah, another important factor in the matchup, I think, is Dragon's Rage Channeler, which is a card I don't like in particular myself. But Murktide players are split when it comes to this inclusion in the deck, and Living End is the matchup in which, in my opinion, Darcy is at its best, because it's another 1-drop you can play alongside Ragavan, and we already established that having pressure as a Murktide player is extremely important in the matchup. And on top of that, it helps you dig towards relevant cards for 0 mana, which is huge. Especially pre-board, when you have less relevant cards than you have post-board. So, yep, Darcy really good in the matchup. And while we are on a topic of mana, in general, cards that cost more than 1 mana in the blue-red deck are pretty bad in the matchup, outside from counterspell and from a 2-mana creature if you are on the play. So that you can resolve it and start pressuring once again. Pressure is really important. Okay, how about some tips and tricks from the from the living end side in that matchup, Sodek?
Okay, so there are some like easier ones to get. For instance, how to force the living end resolve. Like the most important, the more important one is end of turn violent outburst, or maybe upkeep violent outburst once the Murktide player didn't have an option to play a land to from hand to play. So, for instance, if you have your turn free and you have Fawn as a backup, there's a possibility that going turn free upkeep violent outburst instead of turn free end of turn violent outburst with the Fawn backup as a like guarantee protection from counterspell can be a better option than just waiting. Although, if the opponent has a like already like impressive graveyard, so for instance they have Dragon's Rage Channeler and they surveilled a few cards, we can just refuse to fight for the living end and just cast Big Murktide to block your creatures. So that's kind of tricky, and like it's always nice, like always think what you want to do and then start doing making your actions, because like narrowing your like line of thought into this, you always cast turn free outburst on upkeep, or you always cast on end step, can cost you some games. About grief, in my opinion, and like from based from what I saw when I was like doing coaching stuff and other like watching streams, etc. I saw that many living end players really like to play Grief early, like on turn 1, turn 2, or like turn 3 when they don't have a Cascade spell. In my opinion, you should do quite the opposite. You should go for your Grief when you want to play your Cascade spell, because there are two reasons. First is that if you go for turn 1 Grief, there's a quite big chance that you will have to sacrifice your good black cards, for instance, Cyclers like Street Race, Architects of Will, or another Grief that can be useful later on. And like by waiting, there's a non-zero chance that you will draw living ends to your hand, and this like waiting with this Grief would mean that you will use an otherwise dead card. And in a matchup when you want like create any card advantage before you cast living end, like using every card you draw is quite important. And there's also a second thing, that like Murktide players see a lot of cards when they are playing the game of Magic, and there are many situations when like saw people playing Grief early, they didn't see any counter magic, so they discarded like a useless card in a matchup, and after that like opponents surveilled a couple times and they found the counter spell, and the game was maybe not over, but it made useless the Grief being useless. So instead, I strongly recommend you to wait with your Grief and cast it on the same turn with the cascade spell, cascade action. There are some exceptions, like you already like post sideboard, you already casted something, and you are not sure if you want to go for the cascade action now or the next turn, but you technically could, and casting a Grief would trigger a connive. Then maybe waiting another turn to go for it can be worth it, but it's very like corner case scenario and you shouldn't focus on it. In generally speaking, in game 1, wait with your Grief and use the worst cards to fuel it.
All right. So we already touched upon timing of Grief and on how to sequence your cascade spells with your free protection spells. What about flex cards that you see in most living end decks? Because around like 57 cards in every living end deck are basically the same, 56, so upwards of 55 in general. But you have a few slots that you can dedicate to more cyclers or more lands maybe. Or you can play things like Subtlety or Brazen Borrower. What do you think about those cards, Sodek, in the matchup?
Okay, so I think that all, maybe not all, but most flex cards are kind of useless. Brazen Borrower has its moments when, because it can bounce like a big Murktide Regent or big Ledger Shredder, if it threatens to kill you, and can be a blocker for the Murktide later on. But it's a very narrow situation, and once, like we said at the beginning, the fight in the matchup is on the stack, not on the board. So I strongly recommend to use cards that are good on the stack. About subtlety, the one moment when I see when subtlety can be good is when opponent plays turn to Ledger Shredder on the play. There's on this one moment I think that mm, going for subtlety, even for this evoke cost, is worth it because they will not be able to set up the pressure, and from the next turn, if they tap out for the Ledger Shredder, you will be able to play a third land and go for the Cascade. So it will be much harder for them to cast Ledger Shredder again. So it should buy you more time to draw into your interaction and more Cascade spells moving forward. All other cards like Endurance, uh, probably Endurance was the only one also played, or like Colossal, Sky Turtle, they're quite narrow. Endurance was really good in the world when there was only like Dragon's Rage Channeler builds without Ledger Shredder, but nowadays the Murktide players are not as focused on the graveyard as they were like before Streets of New Capenna came out. So I'm not the biggest fan of the card. It's obviously good. It's a really great card, but again, I would if I could choose what to draw, Grief or Endurance, I would nearly always choose Grief, just to have more protection against counter spells.
All right. As far as tips and tricks from the blue-red side goes, the most important one, or the most like tricky one, we did already mention, it's Shredder conniving away creatures to get a better board after living and resolves. And we already mentioned, or Sodek mentioned it, it was, I think, the very first sentence, or one of the first sentence he actually said in this video, that game one favors living end. Maybe not by much, but it favors living end quite decisively. It is possible to win as a Murktide player, but not that likely. But Sodek also mentioned quite quickly after declaring living and a favored deck pre-board that post-board the situation changes rather significantly. So what are the things that changes from the living end perspective after board, Sodek?
For sure, that's the dedicated hate. It does not need to be a hard one. So for instance, so for instance, we don't see that many Chalice of the Voids in the sideboard, maybe outside like some local metagame situations when like Cascade decks are extremely popular. But instead, Murktide players are more on playing cards like Flusterstorm, Unlicensed Hairs, more Spell Pierces, and more other soft counter magic like Mystical Dispute. The fact that and there's of course like Blood Moon effects then can steal the game if you are not prepared, or if they are cast on turn to on the play, but we'll probably get into this later. From the living end perspective, it's much harder to win because Murktide player gets new tools to fight the matchup, and we don't. Some people would say that there's Mystical Dispute for the living end player, but this is not an ideal card in the matchup because it costs mana and it has to be cast on the very same turn you go for the Cascade action. So the window when this card works is not the biggest. It's good on turns like 4 to 6, most likely, because later on opponent will most likely be able to pay for it. It's even worse if the opponent has Ragavan unchecked, and Like, it's still played in sideboards. Maybe it won't be in the near future, but it's not an ideal option. So, Jędrek, from your perspective, what are the best cards that a Murktide player can have in this matchup?
I do think that the card I like the most when I'm trying to beat Living End is, I think, Flusterstorm. It's a card that can be only really answered by Grief. And unlike Graveyard Hate, that can be dealt with by basically an interaction you will have Postboard sans Mystical Dispute probably. You can Grief it, you can force it, you can have some disenchant effect. Flusterstorm is Grief or Bust, and you can make land drops and play around it, but it's much harder to do so against Flusterstorm than against Spell Pierce, because by default you get 3 Flusterstorms or 2 copies of Flusterstorm, because Living End and Cascade are 2 spells and Flusterstorm itself is a 3rd one. And even adding like a Consider beforehand or Mishra's Bubble or some other cheap spell already makes it into pay additional 4, which is quite hard to get in Living End, even in like longer games. So I would say that if you really want to beat Living End, and you have many sideboard slots to spare, you should probably play for Leyline of the Voids. But if you are a reasonable modern player and you are not playing like some weird 8-person event when you know that many people will play Living End, but you are playing an open field tournament like a PTQ or the RCQs that we see all over the world right now, or some sort of GP-like event, I think that playing as many Flusterstorm as you can is probably the best idea. But also, it is really, really important, I think, to have mixed hate in the sideboard so we can attack them from different angle. Like ideally, you will have some amount of Flusterstorms. You will have I think my ideal sideboard for Living End would have 1 copy of Chalice of the Void, because it's a card that shuts down all of their Living Ends, and it requires a disenchant effect once it's on the board, or whatever, I guess, but it limits them much more than like a Tormod script, because they can overpower Tormod script, and even if they don't with first Cascade, they will just cycle before they play another Cascade. And Chalice of the Void is a card that they actually need to deal with. So Chalice is pretty okay if you really want to beat Living End, but it's not a very broad card, and it has its weaknesses, because if they manage to answer Chalice, all of its work is basically undone, because you haven't touched their graveyard, and they will just cast Cascade, and it would be like Chalice was never on the battlefield in the first place. So other than dedicated cards like Chalice and counter magic, mostly Flusterstorm, and also like additional copies of Spell Pierce, like in general, you want cards that cost 1 or ideally 0 mana to combat Living End, because of how constraining on mana this deck can be, especially when they are on the play. When it comes to Graveyard Hate, which is another axis on which you often see people trying to fight Living End, we will go with the same principle of less being better or less being more, and the less you pay for your Grave Hate, the better it probably is in the matchup, especially on the draw. On the play, it might change. I do think that the best Graveyard Hate card against Living End on the play, once again aside from Leyline, but the cards that you can actually cast, is Relic of Progenitus. It costs 1 mana to just keep it open at all times, and on the turn that you play it sorta costs 2 to fire it off immediately. So on the draw, it's very often that you want to wait till turn 2 with it, so you can protect it with like Spell Pierce, but then you don't have mana to crack it on turn 3 if you're on the draw. On the play, you can just play it on 2 with Spell Pierce, and then they can't cascade on their own turn. So on the play, my ranking of graveyard hate artifacts against Living End would be Relic being the best one. Then we have Tormod Script. Then we have cards like Soul Guide Lantern that are 1 mana, 1-shot exile effects. And then we have Unlicensed Hearth, which is the most played card, the most played graveyard hate in Murktide right now, mostly because of its strength in the mirror. And on the play, maybe you can move Hearth over Soul Guide if you have it precisely on turn 2. So yeah, I think it's Relic, then Crypt, then Hearth on 2, then Soul Guide, then Hearth on any other turn than 2. Because even if they answer it, they can't cascade right away. And it will gradually eat their graveyard. And at some point, you can just play Ragavan, Crew, Hearth, and just one-shot them. So Hearth's power level varies dramatically depending on when you play it. So Hearth on 2 is quite excellent, and Hearth later on gets much, much worse. On the draw, as I already said, even more so, costing no mana is really important. So on the draw, I think that Crypt is your best bet because it costs 0 mana to both play and activate. So you can actually manage to play it with protection before they attempt to cascade. Then we have Relic and Soul Guide that I think are both in a similar power level on the draw. Once again, because Relic costs 2 mana effectively on the turn you play it. And then finally we have Hearth, which can be a liability as another 2-drop on the draw. And that's it when it comes to sideboard hate cards. And important part of all that I already said, mostly about those cards being cheaper, is that you have more relevant cheap cards and your play patterns and especially mulligans should be affected by this. Because pre-board, you will often find yourself keeping hands like Ragavan into Archmage's Charm because you just can't bank on having a better hand in the matchup pre-board because you don't have tools necessary to beat them. On the draw, or post-board rather though, you can have hands like, you can count on having like 2 1 mana or less cards that are good in the matchup. So you can mulligan hands like Counterspell, Ledger Shredder, and some lands plus cantrips plus other less relevant stuff on the draw. You can try to mulligan aggressively into 2 1 mana cards. And one of the best ways to leverage your 1 mana cards, or more importantly Ragavan, is Blood Moon, which I haven't mentioned before, but it's the final nail, maybe not final nail in the coffin, but final angle of attack you have in the matchup. Because Living End is basically a mono blue deck that splashes 2 colors, but those 2 colors are really important when it comes to cascading, because their cascade spells are both multicolored, and they're both green. So having a Ragavan into Blood Moon, especially on the play, is one of the best draws you can have. Or more accurately, Ragavan into Magus of the Moon, because Magus of the Moon is a harder card for them to answer because they can't force it or disenchant it. So that's also something you should be looking for. Like, I think that the hand of Ragavan, Magus of the Moon, and literally 5 lands is a pretty great hand on the play against Living End, especially if some of those lands are islands and or fetch lands.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Like from my perspective, this start is close to unbeatable because like you can get basics while playing Living End. That's why we are playing basic forest, basic island, a bunch of fetch lands, but you can also play 1 land per turn. And if opponent starts Ragavan into Magus and you have only 1 land drop, you have a decision. Do you want to go for an island to keep cycling but not being able to cast any of your cascade spells because it will require green mana too, or you can go for the forest and not be able to cycle anything So you will be able to cast a Violent Outburst, but without anything on the board.
Yeah, you basically need to get lucky and draw one of your basics and fetch the other one.
No, like going for the island is probably safer because you have Otawaras in the deck, so you
Yes,
can
of
at
course.
least bounce Margus, so it will help. But it's really annoying to play against. Also, from living at perspective, what you said about these hate cards like Blood Moon, Unlicensed Hairs, etc., kind of forces living at player to change the way of casting Grief. Like I said about game one. Grief actions that they should happen at the last possible moment. This can change from time to time because if you couldn't go for basics and you are scared of Blood Moon, maybe casting Grief earlier, like on turn 2, is a good thing to do. Or if you are scared of Unlicensed Hells, that's also uh, a reason to go for the earlier Grief. This can cost you gains because this lack of information you get when the opponent will draw more cards can can be a problematic one. But like you can't play around everything as efficiently as you would like to be.
Yes, and I still think that the most important card to grieve is Flusterstorm.
True. Like if opponent does not start with an early drop, like any turn 1 Ragavan and the Ledger Shatter, you can consider waiting because this means that they didn't have any like unlicensed hairs or a grave hit action. They have a bunch of counter spells, so you can afford, assuming you have lands, to play land after land and maybe pay for at least a Spell Pierce or maybe a Faster Storm if there are no other actions involved. So this can be a thing. Also, one thing that changes postboard is how your hard-casted creatures matter. The most often way for the Mercury player to side out is siding out Unholy Hits, some bolts, and probably Expletive Iteration. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, most of the time at least I board out those cards, removal spells, some iterations. And sometimes I do have Jace postboard to manage your creatures. Basically, the function of how good Jace is postboard solely depends on how many ways to lock out their cascade spells you have. Like cheap permanent based ways to make their cascade bad. So chalices, crypts, Teferis if you are splashing white, because then the game devolves into this limited board of just playing 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 mana creatures, and Jace is really damn good at unsummoning those and creating massive tempo advantages. But yes, most of the time, if you play a Curator of Mysteries, a Murktide player will have no removal postboard against it.
Yeah, and sometimes Ledger Shatter will be able to stop it when it grows to 3-5 and being bigger later on, but from time to time, this Curator of Mysteries will be able to stop Ragavan from attacking or at least even take over the game and start attacking the opponent and force the action on casting a Murktide. So this tap out can help you resolve your real threat called Living End.
Okay.
Also forgot about one thing that I should say it on in the game 1 situation about Ragavan. Sometimes it's okay to cast your Shardless Agent on turn 3 even if the chances to resolve Living End are very slim because you will at least get a 2/2 artifact creature in the process. In game 1 it's not that great because they have Unholy Hits to kill it, but post sideboard this play can let you stop the Ragavan attacks. Of course, sometimes the opponent will have another Ragavan to punish you for doing that, but from time to time they will just say pass, and you know that this cascade action was worth the effort.
Okay. So the last card that we want to talk about is the only card that we both have in our sideboards, and that's Mystical Dispute. which is a very unexciting card to bring in in my opinion. You do bring it in, mostly because it can counter, from the Murktide perspective. You bring it in because it counter forces and their disputes, but the fact that it can't counter Living End for 1 mana makes it much worse than otherwise. And I think it's a card that is much, or maybe not much, but significantly or visibly is probably the better word, a visibly better card from Living End perspective against Murktide than the other way around, because you can counter basically any important card with it from Living End perspective. But I know that you are not the biggest fan of Dispute, so maybe you can tell us why you are not so in love in this card as other Cascade people are.
People often ask me why Living End does not play more Mystical Disputes, because it's a great card. Like 1 mana leak is kind of cool. But in practice, we already have Force of Negation and Grief in the deck, plus like regular ways to play against counter spells, like in form of Outburst, end of turn into Shardless Agent on hour. So we can't cite in more than this. Like we have like only these 2 free flex slots that are, like we already said, they aren't the best, and we can try to find some better tools to fight the matchup. Mystical Dispute is fine in the Murktide matchup because these games will often come down to this, like maybe not board style situation, but this land go situation when like Murktide player is scared enough to not play their creatures, and Living End player is scared enough of their untapped mana to go for it. So Mystical Dispute can help you push through, because you can go Outburst end of turn and Dispute, and then you go your another Cascade spell on your turn. But like I said earlier, the window when this card is good isn't is quite narrow, and I would not recommend to have more than 2. 2 is, in my opinion, already a bit too many, and I would like to see and check if there's a chance when Mystical Dispute in Living End could not be played at all. On the other hand, like I'm thinking about other cards I would like to bring in a matchup. There is Deadgon, the card that kills Ragavan, can also kill Magus of the Moon if there's present, and the fact that Ragavan is so important in the matchup in early turns means that maybe having a removal for it can be worth it. I don't know if that's true in the world when some blue-red decks don't play Dragon Age Channelers, so there are like fewer actually good hits for the card, but that's something we can try. There, like you can also cite in a 4th copy of Living End, or just not cite it out if you are playing 4 copies in the main deck already. But I'll say that are not any really good cards, and maybe that's why people are on Mystical Disputes, not because it's great, because it's time sensitive and like can be clunky from time to time, but because there are just not any other better option than this.
Okay, so that's basically it. That's what we have to say about the matchup. So after those almost 50 minutes of taking it apart for the like small things that are just building blocks, and then you put it back together to get a big picture.
Okay.
So what do you think, like closing thoughts on the matchup? What do you think about it?
Closing thoughts on the matchup. Turn 1 Ragavan is probably the most important play, and if the opponent, like Murktide player, has Ragavan or does not have it, that dictates every other play you make in the matchup, because this will or will not let you to wait with your spells and try to build to engineer a situation when you can fight through like 4 counter spells, and sometimes you have to go for it earlier on. Post sideboard, the matchup is much harder for Living End because Murktide player has tools to stop you, and Living End player does not have any interesting cards to side in.
Okay.
Overall, I feel that the matchup is close. The matchup is, I think it's at like 48 to 52 for Murktide player. But they're like just random percentages I said, and like in the end of the day, it will come down to players' skill set and how they can navigate the game.
Yep, I mostly agree. As you know, I'm not the biggest fan of percentages in general. I do think that the matchup is close. I do feel that if Murktide player win game 1, they are in a very, very comfortable spot. I usually expect to lose game 1 and try to win both post-sideboard games, but in an event of winning game 1, I feel really favored at that point. But overall, I think it's close. And a pretty interesting matchup to play, definitely. Okay, so that's it. You can find all of the important links below, our Twitch streams, our Twitter accounts, and most importantly, our website, Mystical Teachings. You see the name above. It's where we have all of our content. We do have we can safely say renowned sideboard guides at this point that you can access then there on premium side of the webpage, as well as other free content, including all those videos, some written articles as well, written content. And yeah, thanks for watching. As always, take care and bye-bye.
And see ya.